Hello, everybody. We've done lots of shows in the past, lots of new books about how knowledge is being destroyed and how we all want to know the truth, but it's simply not out there. The media or books or something else or someone else is destroying truth. But our guest today, Mark Lilla, one of the most distinguished of American intellectuals, has a new book out. It's about the surprising allure of ignorance. He wrote about it in an op-ed in the New York Times earlier this month. The book is called Ignorance and Bliss on Wanting Not to Know. Mark Lilla is joining us from his home in Manhattan. Mark, congratulations on the new book. Do we really not want to know? Is that the human condition?
No, the human condition is to both want to know and want not to know. And so all of us have obviously things we want to know because they serve some immediate purpose. A part of the population also just is curious about how things begin and how things work. But then all of us have, even at the most mundane level, a need not to know particular things. So a soldier going into battle should not be told his or her chances of survival. We should be careful about asking, for example, an example I use in the book, and I assume there'll be writers here who are watching this. You have to think twice before you show your work to a senior writer and figure out whether knowing the truth of their opinion would be good for you or not. We also do very mundane things all the time just to keep a sense of ourselves. And certainly as we age, I don't think I'm just speaking for myself. You know, we walk before mirrors rather self-consciously and store windows and suck our stomachs up or
yeah, you wrote about the sucking of the stomachs out in an interesting piece for Harper's a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
You say illusions require active work. We suck in our stomachs when we walk past a shop window or elaborately comb our hair to mask encroaching baldness.
Yeah, and so there are all these little ways in which also it's rational not to know. Another example I use in the book is, what if everyone, every human had a kind of LED screen on their foreheads, and that allowed others to read your thoughts and you could read theirs? Well, everyone would be paralyzed. And certainly you would not be able to develop a sense of yourself if you were constantly worrying about what others were thinking of you. And so certainly even to become a self, an autonomous self, there are certain things that you need not to know.
I wonder, Mark, if in that case, I mean, I want to talk about technology later, but if indeed we did have chips in ourselves, which may not be even that science fiction, maybe we'll have these by the end of the 21st century, which allow us to know what other people think, that would actually simply alter our thoughts, that the cat and mouse game we play with ourselves and the world would simply change.
And the thing is, we don't even control our thoughts, right? Because thoughts come to us. It's not that we decide, oh, I'm going to think now that that's not a very intelligent person. It's just the thought's there. And so, yeah, it would be a very inhuman nightmare if there weren't things that we don't know. Now, there are other things which are not good for us not to know, perhaps, and we can talk about those when you want to.
Yours, the book is a series of essays, but it's an intellectual history of truth, or the idea of truth, and not wanting to know. Of course, in many ways, these kind of books always begin in Plato's cave or in Socrates' cave. What does that famous scene from Plato's Republic tell us about wanting to know, or perhaps what not to know?
Yeah, well, the image is very complex. So the notion is that a bunch of people are in a cave and they're chained to the ground, and something holds their heads forward so all they can see is a wall on which there are shadows of things behind them that are being manipulated by other people. So, having not seen anything else, they think those shadows are reality. One day, someone comes down and turns the head forcibly of someone down there, and that person realizes what the human condition at that point is. And then this person who comes down, this angelic almost figure, starts dragging the cave dweller up these steps closer and closer to the light. And there's reluctance, resistance. They keep falling, bruising themselves. And finally, they come up into the sun, where it's possible to see the ideas, as Plato called them, sort of the modes of ultimate reality. And you would think, well, that's the point. But sometime later, this person comes back and says, well, just as I was asked to go down and bring you up, I'm now asking you to go down and bring someone else up. And so that person descends, but his vision is off because he's been looking at the light all the time, and suddenly he's back in darkness. So he arrives in the cave, sort of night blind, and starts falling over things and knocking them over, and he's mocked. And some of them even want to kill him. And so it's very hard for him to figure out how to bring someone else up in this condition. And that's meant to be an allegory, the latter part of the life of Socrates, of having seen what is. Socrates has to learn how to live in the twilight and bring other people up into the light. So that's the classic story.
Mark, The Republic, of course, written by Plato, is, and who knows how satirical it is, but it's a book about an ideal state ruled by intellectuals, people, philosophers, philosopher kings who know the truth. Socrates, when I was at least taught this book, as Socrates might not have quite agreed with Plato. You've written a lot on politics as well. Politics these days, in our age of populism, is unavoidable. You wrote an interesting piece in New York Review recently about what you called another change election, which you suggested that Americans seem to be a little deluded. What's the relationship between democracy and ignorance? Could we have a viable democracy where nobody was ignorant, or is ignorance required in a democracy for it to work properly?
Yeah, well, I think actually for any political regime, there are things we need to know and things that it's better that we don't know. The great danger in democracy is that it declines into tyranny, that people who try to rule themselves become unreasonable, they become fractious, and any sense of high and low in terms of culture and learning disappears, and life becomes so unbearable that a person comes along and says, I can solve all your problems. You can all remain equal, just like you are now. It's just you had no right to make decisions. I will make the decisions from now on. And so a way to what one has to worry about in democracy is that it produces elites that are able to help guide it, in particular in educating the young, so that not only in science and things like that, but also so they understand how the government itself works and why you might need, say, a constitution. And so somehow this knowledge needs to be passed on. The problem is that in a sort of simple-minded democracy, everyone is so jealous of their sense of independence and equality that they develop attitudes that are anti-elitist. And when that happens, that actually starts this descent into tyranny as well. That it's not that those who are elites are wrong about X, Y, or Z. They might very well be. It's that they pretend to know more than the average person. And if there's one thing I think all of us don't want to know is uh, the degree of our ignorance.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece in Unheard about this, about America's new caste system, and the way in which the education gap has dented democracy. But I'm not sure if maybe you carefully sidestep the question on democracy and ignorance or truth. I mean, Plato wrote this book, which has this parable of the cave in it about the value of the truth. It's the foundations of Western philosophy. And yet Plato was talking about a kind of dictatorship of intellectuals.
Well, I think that's the wrong reading of Plato, actually,
Okay.
in two respects. One is that even in the image of the cave, what you see is that someone who's lived in the light has a hard time living in the twilight with everyone else. And so it's not as if you can just enlighten people with a magic wand. And so that's a political problem for those who know, for knowledge itself. But on the other hand, one has to bear in mind that about 2/3 through the Republic, after the people talking in it make all these crazy assumptions about how the philosopher kings could be trained, and we wouldn't know who their parents were and all the rest, is that as soon as that's developed in conversation, it immediately falls apart. And the rest of the dialogue is about the impossibility of maintaining a philosopher rulers. And so that all the other regimes that get talked about are sort of decaying versions of that ideal. And that's how we get aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and eventually tyranny.
So are you suggesting that Plato was intentionally satirical
I wouldn't
in
use,
recognizing that this supposed utopia or promised land where you had philosophy kings wasn't really possible? He was waking people up to its
yeah,
unreality.
yeah, I would say not sarcastic, but ironic. And ironic not in the sense of a kind of snarky knowingness, but that it turns out to be the case for human beings that if you tried to govern human beings who are a mix of intelligence and passion and desires, according to some simple rational standard, which you would think would be the ideal, turns out not to be at all, because eventually it will decay into tyranny.
The other thing, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know these books a million times better than I do, but the other concept I remember from the Republic is the ideal of the noble lie of all systems, political systems, at least being rooted on one lie that props it up. What's the relationship, Mark, between lying and ignorance? They're different things, aren't they?
Well, it depends on whether the lies are noble or not. For example, um, we tell our children fictions about sex, or we don't mention it up until an age uh, at, at which we think they're able to handle it and process it. And we don't perform a truth dump on them the moment they can understand human speech. And so we tell untruths in order to get them in a position where then they're able to receive truth. And so we have to do these things all the time. You know, the way monarchies worked was to, put any ordinary person in ermine and robes with a piece of silver on his head and declare that not only he, but also his male descendants were all the best possible rulers. And it's not, we know from experience that's not the case, but it keeps the kind of sanctity of the laws and of the monarch protected. So we have to do this all the time in life. But the thing that we have to beware of is lying to ourselves. And we lie to ourselves to the extent that we're aware of it. Primarily, I think, because there's something we feel there's something shameful about our not knowing particular things, so we become defensive. You know, I've started to think about ideas not as little things that we hold in our heads, but they're also sort of prostheses that stick out. And so when one of our opinions that we hold to be true is questioned or refuted, it feels like we've lost a limb. And, Socrates said there's no shame in not knowing something, and you should thank the person who enlightens you, but that's definitely not the way we feel.
Socrates also said that was truth was knowing oneself. We talked a little bit about the noble lie. Is there a noble lie in your view when it comes to the self? Do we have, and I use this term carefully, I don't quite know what it means, but do we have the right to lie to ourselves about certain things?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's a right so much as whether
Or a
it's
responsibility, perhaps, a
a
self
responsibility.
responsibility
Exactly, exactly.
for
Uh,
preservation?
yeah, exactly. And so if we had a full knowledge of ourselves, let's say knowing the things we know, plus all these things that escape our attention because we're very good at keeping our eyes from looking at that part of the room where those things are. Um, if we were to see everything all at once, let's say, or if everything we've done in the past were present to mind at every second, uh, there are reasons to think that we would just lose hope and lose hope in ourselves. And so, in order to keep on plugging ahead with some not too elevated sense that we can accomplish what we do, uh, we again would be paralyzed. And so there's this, little dance, you might say, that goes on. I use a metaphor in the book of badminton, where one side is hitting it, that's the side that wants to know. The other side that knows it shouldn't know knocks it back. And so we're all stuck in this in between.
And isn't that game, perhaps you use the term badminton, isn't that what art is? I mean, painters, Dostoevsky, I mean, all the great artists are surprisingly adept at that game of badminton. It's a game which they play with themselves.
Yes, they are, and what's extraordinary, I guess, is two things. One that is that what can pop out of that is the imagination, which seems to come from nowhere. I mean, where does it come from when we imagine something? Something we've never imagined before. We don't know even how to explain it. It's like every moment of our lives is a eureka moment, and for some artists, and I would say even people who present themselves as prophets or mystics, are very open to that experience. The extent to which they understand themselves apart from that, if you read enough literary biographies of some of these great figures or their diaries, even more, you can see this whole game of playing peekaboo with the self going on.
So does that create, in a sense, a category? Maybe it's not a philosophical category. Maybe it's an anti-philosophical category above truth.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. I like that. Yes, well, it turns out that there are, I think what you're pointing to is that you're hoping to have a faculty that sits above your desire to know and your desire not to know, sort of sorting out uh, at every moment which one should be operative. And so, one way of answering your question might be to say that uh, there are two sorts of truths that you and I are talking about. One is a truth which is just about what is the case, right? The other is a truth about what is the case for us as human beings we're trying to know. And it turns out that we can't seek knowledge, and this was Socrates' fundamental insight, can't seek knowledge and continue to do it without getting off track or becoming vain or whatever distracts us from following the truth. That we have to know ourselves, and that means knowing our limits, knowing what we can and can't do. And part of the play of Plato's dialogues is that when Socrates talks to people, um, it's they who are revealing themselves to him, not the other way around. And in reading these stories, we can sometimes see ourselves, that I'm the kind of person who sort of gets off the train of logic right here because I get tired, or it seems removed from reality, or I'm getting annoyed because I think it's questioning something I believe in. So you're right to point out to this double level that we have to be aware of.
Mark, you mentioned earlier about what parents should and shouldn't teach their kids about sex. I know you write in the book about Freud. Freud has some ideas on relations between children and parents, which for many children and parents, perhaps ignorance is bliss. How does Freud play into this? What's his role in the blissfulness of ignorance? He didn't seem to think ignorance was very blissful.
Well, there was toxic ignorance and non-toxic ignorance. Certainly, Freud didn't think that the aspiration or even the possibility of analysis was meant to strip us bare. I mean, there are an infinite number of things about us that might be revealed.
Literally or otherwise, right?
Right. But if a person is suffering, the question is whether that suffering is arising from a truth that this person either has trouble acknowledging out of fear that it will be harmful, or imagines something to be true which is not the case. And so the job of psychoanalysis is to sort of coax the tiger out of the cage once the door is open and make it create a safe space in the analytic situation where a person can avow their thoughts and fears, and it becomes detoxified. That's the idea, anyway, that it becomes toxified, and they can return to their lives, not having had an epiphany about everything in their lives, but no longer repeating the same mistakes, hurting themselves, and in the process harming others.
But if Freud's right, or again, it's a rather vulgar treatment of Freud, you'll correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but if all young boys want to sleep with their mothers, it's a very disturbing idea. Of course, how do we maintain our sanity in terms of knowledge, the opposite of ignorance? I mean, is the inevitable outcome of a real philosopher a kind of Nietzschean madness? Socrates kept his sanity maybe by asking questions, but what's the relationship between ignorance and sanity, Mark?
Well, you began with the example of wanting to sleep with your mother, and an example that I think touches on both the things you said is the example of Oedipus, who, for those of you who listening who don't quite remember the story, Oedipus is born to a king and his wife, and the king heard a prophecy that his son was going to kill him, and so he had him put out in the fields to die. He was picked up, another king adopts him, and one day Oedipus meets his father, who he doesn't know is his father, and in fact does kill him. And so that's the first tragic situation. The other is that he goes back to Thebes in this case, and now that the queen is a widow, he marries her, and she's the queen, and she's also his mother and his wife. And which this is why Freud focused on this story when talking about infant sexuality. And poor Oedipus, it's a real tragedy, not a Hollywood tragedy where there's a sappy, happy ending at the end. But Oedipus goes mad. When he finally realizes what his situation is, his wife mother hangs herself. He plucks out his eyes and spends the rest of his life wandering around with one of his daughters until he dies. And that is our tragic situation, certainly in the view of these ancient mythologies, that that it's not possible to reconcile all these things, or even sometimes to fully know ourselves and our situation. One reads the play hoping neither Oedipus nor his mother wife discover what is really the case, but they do.
But again, going back to Nietzsche and perhaps his principal interpreter, Foucault, the French historian, is madness a form of sanity here? If you really are seeking the truth, there's an element of insanity here. So maybe we're turning all these traditional notions on their head.
Well, I don't think so, and I certainly have never even fully understood the claim that madness is a form of rationality.
There is a suggestion of that in that school of historiography, isn't there?
No, absolutely. And Nietzsche and Foucault both, absolutely. But I've never understood it because it seems to me that you lose the value of both of those terms by making that statement. But in any case, I guess what certainly the Platonic dialogues try to teach, and later thinkers as well, later philosophers in their own way, Spinoza is one example, that something short of madness is having a tragic view of life, in the sense that we can't have everything and be everything at the same time, that we can't fully control our destinies. No one is perfect, all those sorts of things. And to somehow be able to carry on with hope and hopefully good cheer. And so it's melodramatic to say that reasoning until the end is going to put you in a state where you're better off in a straitjacket.
Mark, you're not the most popular person on the religious right. I found a piece in the Federalist suggesting that this liberal academic, that's you, you're certainly an academic, I'm not sure if you're liberal, you've written books on liberalism, wants Christians to leave politics to leftists. But I thought your book was actually rather kind to religion. Your treatment of Augustine and the relationship between Augustine and God was perhaps the best argument about, or not let's say the best argument, but the most complex and interesting argument about the value of self-knowledge. Explain how Augustine fits into your argument.
Right. Let me just back up for a second, though, and make clear that I never suggested what that headline.
No, I'm sure not. Yeah.
I wrote a piece actually about, and it may turn out to be relevant to our conversation. I wrote an article about the new post-liberal Catholic right. A number of thinkers who've converted to Catholicism recently and consider themselves more Catholic than the Pope, literally, and their attempt, and they become quite popular with this, to talk about moving past liberal society with all of its governing norms and many of its institutions in order to somehow put political authority under God's care. And what struck me in all of that is that it seems to me that the Christian message has the most effect when it moves from the bottom up and doesn't trickle down. That is, that You go around, you preach the gospel, you convince people of its truth, people lead better lives, and they pass that on. But these are people who are very power hungry and want an immediate change in society. So,
Yeah, and I think that piece, I saw you actually at the Liberalism for the 21st Century last year or actually earlier this year in DC. I'm guessing that piece sort of came as a response. But anyway, back to Augustine, who's probably more interesting.
yeah, well, the Augustine's, you said it, it's one of the most extraordinary writings about the struggle for and against self-knowledge. So Augustine is born to a woman who converts to Christianity, and she prays for her son to become a Christian himself. He resists.
Monica, wasn't her name?
Monica, exactly. And he resists this. He's very bright. He gets an education in rhetoric, in philosophy. He also has these yearnings, and so he starts dabbling around with various mystical sects looking for something. And he keeps running up against a wall of just not believing or something like that. But also, it's clear that he's unhappy and he doesn't know why. And so, the moment of his conversion happens in a garden where he's gone out after having heard someone's story about how the gospel had changed their lives. And he hears a child off in the distance say, pick up and read, not knowing what it referred to. And in front of him is a Bible. He opens the Bible and he finds a verse that speaks to his condition. And then he described what happened in this way. He said, at that moment, God pulled me up from behind myself and placed myself before myself so I could see my wretched, sinful condition. And that's the end of his life, pre-Christian life, and it begins again. So imagine that you have a self or a front visage laminated to your back that you can't see, but often others can. Well, the moment of conversion comes when you see how much you need God and you see how you've been lying to yourself. And yeah, it's more dramatic than just about any conversion story I can think of.
And it seems to be quite a good argument for God. I mean, maybe not for the epistemological truth of God, but for our invention of him to force us to be truthful, or at least to acknowledge that there is someone or something out there that knows everything, that so at some point or other the truth will be revealed.
Well, that's what one German philosopher called the ditch that he was unable to jump over.
Who was that?
That was Lessing. And when you reach that point, the question is, do you continue to think skeptically about the rest of your life now that something has been revealed to you about yourself? Because bear in mind, Augustine's story is not that God reveals the nature of God to Augustine. God reveals Augustine's nature to himself.
Mm.
And so that's tough knowledge. And so an instinct might be to want help with that and to panic. And one way of reading Augustine is that's exactly what he did. Rather than picking up, trying to metabolize that knowledge and move forward, cognizant of it. I don't see why that necessarily has to make one a believer, but as a story, it certainly brings people right to the doorstep of where they can perform all sorts of leaps. And
yeah, and of course it introduces the therapist and the idea of guilt and all our other modern concepts. Let's end, Mark, with some analysis of our current moment when it comes to truth or our ignorance. You were on the show a year ago. You were talking to me from Rome and we titled the piece. This was before Trump was reelected. Why progressives must free themselves from a nostalgia-fueled faith in past and future alike. Are progressives themselves particularly ignorant? Are they suffering a kind of blissful ignorance these days in late 2024?
No, I think that we all are selective in our vision. We all hold on to the errors that we make just because they're ours. But different political formations and ideologies might be prone to be blind to particular things, and a kind of studied blindness, which causes them to try to explain away, in particular when things aren't working for them, because they have their own standard answers of what must be done. And so, for example, for progressives, two defeats in the face of Donald Trump might suggest that the idea of militating for particular single issues that you're morally attached to, no matter what the public thinks, is not the way to win power and protect the people you want to protect. But there's a stubbornness that we have, because if something's exposed, we feel ashamed, we feel we've betrayed our friends, we feel we've betrayed ourselves. And I could go down the ideological line of the sorts of illusions and self delusions to which different political ideologies seem to be prone.
You recently wrote a couple of introductions to important books, The Treason of the Intellectuals, which is early 20th century critique of intellectual life, and then Reflections of a Non-Political Man by Thomas Mann, another First World War book. Might the escape from all this, Mark, be a detachment from politics? How does politics play into all this?
Yeah, well, again, to go back to Plato, if you don't mind, he thought that Socrates thought that was the greatest danger, that understanding how unreceptive recalcitrant reality is to our purposes, that we simply throw in the towel and give up. But on the other hand, someone's got to take care of the public sphere. Also, if you just want to be able to live your private free life, you might not be able to, except in certain kind of political formations that allow you to do that. And so we all have a kind of responsibility. I would call it, though I often don't like the phrase, intellectual responsibility to our own intellectual life, which is to pay attention to politics, no matter how otherwise withdrawn we might feel. And I'm feeling, certainly the temptation to withdraw right now. I certainly did in 2016. I don't mean to be melodramatic about it, but, for my liberal side and those to the left of me, things don't look good down the road. And so, but I am, and I know other people are thinking about how to move forward, but the resistance to giving up. Freud called this repetition, right? We commit the same mistake over and over again, thinking that the result will be different. He said that is the definition of neurosis. And there's a lot of political neurosis going around right now, and on my side anyway. And that has to change.
How's that all got to do with liberalism? You're probably best known for your book, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics, which is an uncompromising defense of liberalism. But isn't the foundations of liberalism a kind of relativism? People like John Stuart Mill suggesting, well, not so much a relativism, but suggesting that liberals are always, by definition, thinking differently from others, or that's what liberalism should be, a protection of that?
Well, I think Mill is a good example of how non-relativistic liberalism properly understood is, at the very least, in order to function in a society and with a government that takes liberal principles and institutions and habits of mind and passions uh, seriously, that one has to pay attention to reproducing liberals. And it turns out that the education of liberals who understand the limitations of it and all the rest uh, doesn't just happen through liberal means, and it doesn't happen in with kind of value-free relativistic principles of your own. You have to make clear to the young what a stake they will have in the future, and their parents will, and their brothers and sisters, by maintaining a certain kind of political order. And on the other hand, the kind of nobility that is possible without being pushed into it by the tip of a spear, to live a kind of open, free, yet responsible life, open to the truth, is kind of the liberal vision. But it requires education in hiding certain things. For example, um, it's not helpful at the beginning of the education of the young to reveal all the faults of the society that they live in, because they should be revealed later on. But first, they need to feel attached to it. And they need to feel attached to it because if they aren't, they won't feel compelled by the failures of the society they live in to act. They will, in fact, just roll up into themselves like a bug. And so, first, you have to uh, teach students all the reasons to appreciate democracy, the country you live in, and its history, and so that you can reach them later on. And that's something that it has been lost among liberals. And in part, that was a reason why I wrote the book I did in 2018, that uh, we just have to have a sense that we first need liberals to understand that unless they capture government and exercise power, they can't help the people that they're all excited about. And to do that, you need to start very young by inculcating young people in the values, the institutions, and the history of that society.
But aren't some of these young people, Mark, shall we say, overeducated? The story this week is of a young man, Luigi Mangione, a very distinguished, very successful, smart student at University of Pennsylvania, taught at Stanford. He might be kind of kid who wandered into one of your classes, read lots of books, and decided, because he thought that the healthcare system was unjust, that he had the right to murder a senior healthcare executive. And in fact, there are many people who support him. Is that case? I'm sure you're familiar with it. Is an example of where perhaps liberal education has failed people, that there's this collapse of truth and morality, and when someone does something wrong, they believe they have the right to go around murdering people. I'm not suggesting, of course, that scholars like yourself justify murdering unjust people.
Well, I think that impulse to think you know everything and kill people on the basis of it is bred in the bone ever since we've been walking on two legs. And so I don't see that as anything new. So then the question becomes, does a certain kind of education provoke that kind of response? Or more weakly, uh, does the education not help in limiting or corralling those passions? And I think that can be true of just about any educational system. There's not anything particular about his education. I mean, there are other examples of people who were very bright and therefore thought they had the right. Ted Kaczynski, the sort of math genius who the Unabomber who was selling bombs.
Yeah, and Mangione wrote a sympathetic essay. And of course, also in a slightly different way, Sam Bankman-Fried, whose effective altruism movement was rooted in sort of the right to use other people's money for stuff that he thought was morally right.
That's right. And then, of course, we have history full of, and our contemporary life full of people all over the world who are not educated and get an idea into their heads or a passion like xenophobia that leads to a genocide, things like that. They don't need, they don't need to be reading Plato and Nietzsche and all the other authors that we spoke about today in order to commit a heinous act.
And of course, in Plato, there was the character of Thrasymachus, who was hostile to Socrates, who saw everything in terms of strength. And maybe it's, again, a metaphor of our current age and the MAGA movement. And finally, Mark, you've been very generous with your time. What about the role of AI? You're not a technologist, but a lot of people are very fearful. Some are hopeful about AI. It is a new version of truth. If everything is known, if everything is aggregated, if smart machines are way smarter than any of us, and if we're surrounded with AI in the future, how might this change everything? Is it conceivable that we're entering a period where it will be impossible to be ignorant and therefore perhaps impossible also to be blissful?
No, because there's nothing essentially, AI is a machine to produce best guesses. And the more data you have, the better it's thought the guesses can be. But if, for example, a certain passion overtakes people and they start seeing the world in some cockeyed sort of way, that's not going to be read out of the algorithm. That's going to be put in. I mean, you can already see that when you look at little AI results when they come up on Google and you put in some question about something you know something about. But there's no guarantee that somehow repetition and recursiveness is somehow going to point to a truth, rather perhaps to a widely held and unquestioned untruth. So, I see us being flooded with more information and a kind of false sense of what the tyranny of the majority view is. But I think we've dug ourselves a cave beneath the cave.
No, back in the cave, Mark Lilla. I'm never going to walk past the mirror and think about sucking in my stomach without you. Perhaps you've reminded me not to do that. You're a truth teller, even if you're writing about the blissfulness of ignorance. Congratulations on the new book. And it's always a real honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me again. I really enjoyed it.
Can I step on the scene?